Hello and welcome to this game analysis session at Chess University. My name is Ryan Murphy, and today I will analyze a game of a student who was rated 1434 on chess.com in the rapid category. This was a rapid game, 15-minute time control, and our student had the white pieces. I hope to highlight some of the key critical moments and important concepts in this game for you. So the game began e4, c5, so we have a Sicilian, and the student played c3, the Alapin Sicilian, where white is hoping to build a big center by playing d4, very similar to in the e4, e5 openings. This is one of the main goals when you have the white pieces, to get a space advantage out of the opening or an initiative. So this is what white is trying to do here. Black responds with knight c6, which is already not a very accurate move. More normal moves try to counterattack the e4 pawn, or to strike in the center immediately, such as knight f6, which attacks this pawn on e4. And a normal continuation here would be e5, kicking the knight, knight d5, d4, cd4, cd4, and d6, where black is trying to break down white's strong center. Another very common option after c3 is d5, and the play here generally transposes to an isolated queen's pawn structure, something like this. And at pretty much any point, black can take on d4 and enter the IQP, and play is roughly balanced and pretty complicated and interesting. But in this game, the opponent played knight c6, which doesn't really put any pressure on white's center and allows white to carry out their plan. So in general in chess, if your opponent has a plan, you should try to prevent it if you can. So d4, cd4, cd4, and d6, which again is probably not the most accurate way for black to respond to this opening, sort of just letting white get exactly what they want in the center. Probably more correct is to strike with d5 and try to break up white's central duo immediately. It also activates the light square bishop and the queen. So I think d5 is the way to go here. White could continue by building pressure, knight c3, knight f6, and black shouldn't be afraid of e5 because they can respond with knight e4, and these doubled pawns in the center are not a big deal. In fact, black's doing, I think, reasonably well here with pressure against the d4 point, and also black has a very good grip on the d5 square later, e6, and then planting a piece on d5 to blockade the weakness on d4. Black should be doing reasonably well here. So back to the game. Black played d6, and white just gets to develop very actively with knight c3. A common motif we're going to see in this game that would have given white an even bigger advantage at many points, which white eventually seized on, was to grab a big space advantage straight out of the opening. So white could have immediately played d5, kicking this knight from its most natural square. And then after knight e5, white could continue driving this knight around and gaining space and time with f4, and then play knight c3, and white has a huge center. Black's knight on g6 is not very well placed. It doesn't really have very many squares to go to. So this would be fantastic for white. You might ask here, why can't the knight go to some other square like knight b4? Well, this would be a common tactical blunder in the opening. The knight on b4 being unprotected, white already has a double attack. You can pause the video if you want, but white can win material here with the move queen to a4, delivering a check and also hitting this knight, and the knight no longer has c6 because we're protecting that with our pawn on d5, so white wins a piece. So white plays knight c3, which is a fine move, and a6 from black, which is again a very slow move, not attacking the center, not developing pieces, allowing white to build an initiative. So white is already doing really, really well here. Knight f3, bishop g4, developing the bishop. White played bishop e2 to get out of any sort of pin on the d1 h5 diagonal. Bishop c4 was also possible, a more active move, but bishop e2 is totally fine. Knight f6, putting pressure on e4. And now the student seizes a space advantage with d5. I really like this move. I think this is an excellent idea. So here, black takes first on f3, so that the black knight can go to e5 without incurring double pawns. So bishop take f3, bishop take f3. G takes f3 is also very interesting. A lot of the time, more lower-rated players are afraid of doubled pawns, but in many cases, you can use double pawns dynamically to get an advantage. In this case, the f-pawn would support the center, and later white would be able to play f4, for example, and bishop e3, and just have a really, really good grip on the center, maybe use of the g-file in the future. So this was also an interesting possibility, but bishop takes f3 is completely normal and fine. Knight e5. And this is one of my favorite moves that the student played in this game, just recognizing the nature of the advantage that white has here. White plays the move bishop e2, which I really like. It preserves the bishop pair, and also in many cases prepares to just kick this unstable knight on e5 to drive it away with f4 and gain even more space, and then in the distant future maybe break with e5. So bishop e2 I think is a very nice multi-purpose move, clearing the way for f4, but also just preserving the bishop pair and really controlling both of the knights beautifully. So the knight on f6 doesn't really have anywhere to go. The same can really be said about the knight on e5. So I like this control move. Black played g6, castles, bishop g7. I think this is all very natural up to this point. And here, white commits, I think, the first major inaccuracy of the game. So on move 13 here, white plays the move queen d2, which has a very logical idea in mind. White's creating a battery, connecting rooks, aiming for a move like bishop h6, perhaps with attacking intentions to exchange this defensive bishop, just like in the dragon, and then to weaken the dark squares around black's king as a prelude for a kingside attack. This makes a lot of sense, and it's a very typical plan you'll see. But in this position, just like in dragon positions, it gives away control over this g4 square, which is a little bit irritating for white. So now black seizes the opportunity and plays knight eg4, harassing this dark squared bishop, trying to eliminate white's bishop pair, and potentially strand white with the worst of the two bishops, which would be this bishop on e2. Why is this bishop a bad bishop, potentially? Well, a lot of white's pawns in the center are on light squares, so the scope of the e2 bishop is potentially not so great. So white would really like to get rid of the dark squared bishop, so that the dark squared bishop on g7 would be unopposed on this very strong diagonal. Okay, so queen d2 gives away the g4 square and allows this annoying move knight eg4. White correctly preserves the dark squared bishop, and here black makes a blunder, which turns a position where I think white's still a bit better into one where white's probably just completely winning. So black plays e5, and this is a typical mistake you'll see from beginners. They create attacks without thinking of weaknesses that are made in their own position. And whenever you make a pawn move, you're leaving tons of squares behind. Pawn moves can never be taken back, so you have to be very cautious when you make committal pawn moves. And in this case, maybe black just forgot about the option of en passant. And here, white can already win material. D take e6, f e6. This already weakens the king for black. Also weakens both of these pawns. This is like a hanging pawn structure. The pawn on d6 is literally hanging because we have two attackers and only one defender. So d6 is falling. White's going to be a pawn up with a bishop pair, and the position should be technically winning already. So queen take d6. They trade, and rook f d8. By the way, in this position, black really can't afford to trade queens, and probably they shouldn't also. They're down material. They should try to keep queens on to make the game more complicated and give themselves better chances for counterplay down the road. But they trade, which is a common mistake at lower levels again. When you trade, you should always have an idea in mind. And here, after bishop takes d6, black has a lot of problems. First thing is this rook is hanging, so white's threatening to win an exchange with bishop take f8. And also, white is threatening the move e5, which is a removal of the defender tactic. This knight on f6 is tethered to the knight on g4, which otherwise would be hanging. So if white is able to play e5 and kick away the knight from f6, then the knight on g4 drops and white wins material. So after rook f d8, you can already see what white should have played here. e5 was an incredibly strong move, which would have won the game on the spot. White just wins a huge amount of material here and the game. Instead, the student played bishop g3, missing this tactic, still preserving quite a nice advantage. But e5 would have ended the game much sooner. So always look out for forcing moves in your own games when you sense that your pieces are really active and able to take advantage of an opponent's loose or undefended piece. So always look at checks first and then captures, and then ways that you can attack your opponent's loose pieces. Okay, so black responded knight h6, probably sensing that tactic or seeing the idea that the knight on g4 was potentially hanging. White plays bishop c4, improving the piece, putting pressure on this weak pawn. This is a good move. King f7, activating the king and defending, and rook f d1. So far, after winning the pawn, white's play has been pretty reasonable. They missed one winning tactic, but otherwise everything has made sense. Knight f to g4, h3 drives away the knight to e5, bishop b3, and knight d3. And here, black is getting a little bit of annoying counterplay. It's not so bad, because the knight on h6 is pretty much completely out of play. It has no forward-looking squares to go to. However, the knight on d3 is quite strong and presents a couple of threats. Here white played rook a b1, and black retreated with knight c5 to attack the bishop on b3. But an interesting tactical opportunity was knight takes b2, which is, again, a type of removal of the guard tactic. The pawn on b2 was defending the knight on c3. And so now well, first white should probably offload this rook on d1, and then take, and then black wins back a piece here, having won a pawn back in the process. Now white should still be better here after a move like rook c2, trying to get this bishop to budge and to enter on the 7th rank, which combined with the bishop pair should be still quite good for white. But at least black is no longer down any pawns, and they can fight on, try to hold this position. Okay, so instead of knight takes b2, knight c5 was played. The bishop drops back with bishop c2, defending the e4 pawn. And knight g8. And I think this is a very instructive moment in the game. With the move knight g8, black is obviously trying to fix one of their worst pieces. The knight on h6 was a pretty terrible knight, if we remember that knights on the rim are dim. So where do you guys think that the knight on g8 wants to go? So you can pause and try to figure out what black's idea is to improve this piece. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear that the knight wants to be reintroduced to the game. Not really to e7, where it would still be quite limited by the pawn on e4. But I think this knight wants to go to f6, exerting pressure on the e4 pawn, having more options from that square. So a very logical move is to just remove the f6 square from black's control. So I think e5 is a good move here for white. And then after knight e7, looking to come in like this to f5 or d5, b4, driving away this pesky knight on c5, and after knight d7, knight e4. And we see that black has a big problem on the dark squares. Knight d6 check and knight g5 check are both colossal threats, and white has a huge initiative here. So e5 was a strong prophylactic move to restrict the g8 knight. Instead, f3 was played. And somewhere around here, white's getting a bit low on time. It was a rapid game, and so the play becomes less accurate, but it's still of pretty decent quality. Knight e7, bishop h4. It's not quite clear. White's making, a one-move threat here with a pin on the knight on e7. Then after bishop f6, again, white's low on time, so maybe they don't have so much in the way of time to evaluate exchanges, but this is a very important learning point. White here played bishop take f6, which I think is an inaccuracy. When you have two bishops, it's generally in your favor to keep both of them on the board because they complement each other extremely well. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can't articulate why you're making a trade and how it benefits you, you should probably avoid it, keep the tension, or save your piece. So in this case, bishop f2, preserving the bishop pair was better. So bishop takes f6, king takes, the rooks are exchanged, and we enter this endgame where white is definitely better. Probably in the long run this is winning with an extra pawn, but unfortunately the student was so low on time that they ended up flagging and lost the game. So I'll just flip through the last few moves. In here, unfortunately, white ran out of time. But I still think overall the game was of pretty good quality, as I've said. White missed a few tactical chances to win material. The most notable one was after the exchange of queens to play e5, removing the defender of the g4 knight, which would have won at least an exchange in that position. Earlier in the opening, white's biggest advantage would have come from playing d5 followed by f4, getting a huge advantage in space. But even so, as the position was played by white, white had a lead in development, good center, very nice pieces and active play. The only real big mistake where black was able to sort of get back in the game was when white played queen d2, thus allowing knight g4 and harassing a lot of white's pieces. But besides that, I think white played a very good game, something they can be proud of. If they played a little bit faster, I'm sure they would have had great chances to convert that endgame. So, well done to white, and I hope you guys learned something from this game. So this wraps up the analysis session. I hope you all enjoyed this analysis and learned something new. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for the next analysis session.